Thank you everyone for joining today's Women in Sustainable Finance webinar, which will shine a light on modern slavery. My name is Kelly Seo and I will be your moderator for today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians on the land on which I am connecting with you today, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Before you, you should be able to see a slide which provides a quick snapshot of the key statistics on what modern slavery looks like today. Now, this wouldn't be a webinar during a pandemic if I didn't mention COVID-19 and the impacts COVID-19 had with its factory closures and business interruptions on victims of modern slavery offshore. Victims of modern slavery are more vulnerable to exploitation now than they were ever before. The numbers indicate that modern slavery is actually, in fact, thriving. And looking at the numbers, it's impossible to be isolated from the issue. That's whether you're a consumer, an investor, a financier, or a commercial organisation. Speaking on this complicated issue, today we have three expert panellists: Abigail McGregor from Norton Rose Fulbright, Natasha Morris from Adamantem Capital, and Lauren Solomon, a labour and human rights specialist who was most recently at Allianz. In today's webinar, we will be discussing with our panellists how organisations are responding to the modern slavery legislation requirements, including how they are addressing modern slavery risks within their own operations and supply chains, as well as the direction they see this area revolving. As a matter of housekeeping to our audience members, please feel free to use the Q&A function. I'll try and keep an eye on it as we go through our discussion, and if we have time at the end, we'll answer some questions then as well. To paint the picture, I might first turn to our first panelists. There's no doubt slavery has been around for centuries, but modern slavery seems to be a bit of a buzzword in the last 5 or so years. Abigail, could you give us an indication as to what your role is at Norton Rose Fulbright and provide the audience with some colour on what is modern slavery and the background on the Australian legislation?
Sure. Oh, hi everyone. Nice to meet you all. I lead our business and human rights globally, and that's really because Australia's been more active in this space than nearly any of our other offices. So it means that really Australian business are dealing with things that other countries aren't. And if you are sitting inside a large global entity and you are the Australian part of that entity, you would be forgiven for thinking people were treating you like you were the tail that was trying to wag the dog, because Australia is ahead of the curve on this in a substantial way. In relation to what modern slavery is, so modern slavery, I've lost my little earpiece. Modern slavery is a number of different offences. So within the Modern Slavery Act in Australia, it's defined by Divisions 270 and 271 of the Commonwealth Criminal Code. But it is at its heart the concept that the individuals are not free to leave where they are. So it includes, for instance, traditional slavery. It includes servitude. It includes debt bondage. So debt bondage is the type of activity that you would see where someone has gone into debt in order to move countries, and then they need to pay that debt off to a recruiter, and they're not allowed to leave their job until they do so, and they're paid a very small amount because they're having to repay their debt. They're put up in really poor accommodation. That's the sort of thing that you might see in Australia in, for instance, agriculture, deceptive recruiting, where people think that they're coming to Australia for the purpose of a particular opportunity like education, and that's not really the case. Forced marriage. So forced marriage makes up somewhere near 50% of modern slaves. And then the worst forms of child labour. So it's not all child labour that constitutes modern slavery. The ILO conventions define the worst forms of child labour, and they are, in summary, labour that puts children at risk, either emotionally or physically. And so there's a whole lot of accepted circumstances in which children are put at risk in their workplace. I think the important thing also about modern slavery is that it's not just poor working conditions, or it's not just someone working and not being paid overtime. it's really the pointing end of worker exploitation. So human rights and the rights of workers is much broader than modern slavery. So when people are reporting in relation to or managing modern slavery risk, they're managing one part of their human rights exposure, but not all of it.
Thanks, Abigail. I think that's really important, and obviously we can see that there's been a focus on organisations responding to this modern slavery legislation. This might be a good opportunity to segue to our next speaker, and I can see also answer the first question from our audience, which asks, which sectors are the most likely to be vulnerable to modern slavery risks? Lauren, can I turn to you? And before you answer the question, I'd be interested to hear how you came into your role of Labour and Human Rights Specialist.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. So I've taken a bit of an unusual, journey to get to where I am. I actually started in the fashion industry. I studied fashion design and worked in the creative industries when I was younger. When I worked in this industry, I started asking questions about how things were made and where they were made, and at the time not getting a lot of response. So I was really concerned and sort of started to want to engage with the industry in a different way. I actually then went on to work in London. I worked for a social enterprise that trained women in Malawi, in Africa, in sewing and textiles. So really that social enterprise model, and I actually spent some time on the ground there and saw the challenges and also the benefits that that could bring. When I returned to Australia, I was still kind of stuck grappling with these issues because the model that I saw was fantastic, but I couldn't see it rectifying these hugely complex industry issues. So that actually led to me completing a doctorate. So I ended up looking at worker exploitation and labour rights within the garment industry. As part of that, I conducted on-the-ground work, specifically in Cambodia. And one of the things I looked at is, upskilling women there, specifically union representatives that go into the industry without any education and have to solve these really challenging industrial relations issues. So we were looking at how we could, provide them with some of the skills to do that. So I really got to see on the ground the impact that companies' decisions have. And then once I finished that piece of work, I went back into industry. So I worked with David Jones and Country Road Group. I've worked with Allianz, and most recently I've just joined Perpetual. So really looking at the modern slavery piece and how companies can address that, but taking the learnings that I have from actual supply chains and applying those. In terms of the question,
Thanks, Lauren.
Kelly, that was in you were after the different industries that are more likely to suffer. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's right.
So the way we tend to classify modern slavery, it's looking at industry risk, which could be, as an example, the textiles industry, agriculture, we see construction and shipping. There's also risk in terms of products and raw materials that make up products. So we see things like mining. So that could be for anything like diamonds or jewellery, or it could be cobalt as well. And then that goes into the raw materials for actual things like food and hot beverages, like your coffee and tea and things like that. So it kind of crosses over. And then we also see geographic risk, which mixes in there. So the problem we have is that all these sectors, they overlap and the risks intersect. So that's when we see really the major issues.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think further in our discussion, we'll touch on how that plays a part and what role organisations here can do to address that, identify and address modern slavery risk there. But I just want to pause and touch on your experience offshore. I know you've had experience in Cambodia and China and working on the ground there. And when we think about offshore modern slavery modern slavery, organisations here would be one step removed and may not be aware of the realities of what's actually happening in those highly vulnerable areas. From your experience, Lauren, what are the challenges in addressing modern slavery risks on the ground offshore?
Yeah, look, really good point, Kelly. And I think that's the first challenge is we are so disconnected from the issues. We don't really see the impact. So I think firstly, it's getting people from within corporates to understand that and to actually understand how companies, operations and supply chains can intersect with those risks. In terms of on-the-ground challenges, look, they're really vast. And it is often things that we take for granted. We're, living a very different life to the people that are exploited. It definitely starts with poverty, a lack of opportunity and education, and that drives people to participate in vulnerable employment. So this could be in mining, it could be in the textile industry, it could be in agriculture, and in these industries, that's where we see a lot of child labour, we see really poor working conditions, and that leads to modern slavery, and we see a lack of basic facilities. The union reps that I dealt with were dealing with a lack of access to clean drinking water and to bathrooms. So those things that we have all the time, they definitely don't have. And the other thing is, in those situations, the people are really scared of speaking up. They generally have limited or no access to trade unions. It could be oppressive governments, which actually work in the favour of companies and want to, drive trade. So it's really, really hard for them to actually kind of fight for their rights in these areas. And yeah, I think the other part of the problem is we're dealing with really opaque supply chains that we can't really see. And modern slavery, it hides beyond the surface. We can't see it. So that makes it really, really challenging as well.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I completely agree. Because it's a hidden crime, it makes it really difficult to, one, identify, but two, also manage. Maybe to get a feel for what our colleagues in the finance and private equity space is doing, I might turn to our third panelist, Natasha, who works as a director in responsible investing at Adamantem Capital. Natasha, could you tell us about your experience with modern slavery in your organisation and how modern slavery fits in with Adamantem's broader ESG framework?
Thanks, Kelly, and hello to everybody joining today's important topic discussion. Just for those of you that don't know Adamantem, we're a private equity firm and we invest in Australia and New Zealand businesses, and we invest across a diverse range of industries and sectors. So we've definitely seen some of these issues come up that Lauren was referring to before in terms of the overlap of industry, product and geography and how that translates into looking at modern slavery risk. We have a broad ESG framework that we've developed over the last 18 months, and it's based on 3 pillars of responsible investing, which broadly track E, S and G. So we talk about environmental sustainability, we talk about participation, and we talk about transparency. And for us, modern slavery mostly fits within our ESG framework under this concept of participation. And when we talk about participation and trying to create long-term sustainable businesses that create value, what we're talking about is ensuring that we're creating opportunities, and we talk about both positive economic and social engagement opportunities across all the stakeholders of the businesses that we invest in. So drilling that down into a modern slavery context, what we mean is looking at the operations of our businesses that we invest in and looking at the supply chains of those businesses and ensuring that there are proper economic opportunities for workers in both the operations and the supply chains of those businesses, as well as other stakeholder groups. And we integrate the way we look at modern slavery across our full investment cycle. So we start at the very beginning of the investment cycle and due diligence modern slavery risks when we're looking at a potential investment and a potential business. As Lauren referred to before, this is not always easy as supply chains are opaque, as Lauren mentioned. And the other challenge with supply chains here is they're multi-tiered. So you may have some visibility on who the tier one direct suppliers are. As you try and go up the tiers of the supply chain, that gets much harder, particularly in a due diligence context. We take an approach that's aligned a little bit with how Lauren spoke before, where we try and identify material suppliers, geographical location of supply, the types of products and services supplied, and the sector we're operating in to try and get a high level of appreciation of potential modern slavery risks in potential investments. We also follow it through into our ownership period, and we work very closely with the management teams of the portfolio companies we invest in to deepen their understanding of modern slavery and, to be honest, other ESG risks as well in their operations and supply chains to develop better approaches to assessing and managing those. And I think it is an interesting point that modern slavery is something that there is a piece of Australian legislation on that is a very real risk in businesses, not only in geographies that you would consider high risk, but it is relevant to Australian businesses as well. But it's becoming increasingly interconnected with broader human rights issues and with other ESG issues. We're having a lot of discussions at the moment on the intersection of human rights and climate change risk, for example, in supply chains of businesses. So it is part of a broader picture as well. And then we've also kind of turned the spotlight on ourselves. We are a private equity firm operating in Australia, but we believe that looking at supply chains and modern slavery risks in our businesses that we invest in is important. So we've done the same thing. We are not obliged to report under modern slavery legislation, but we've gone through a voluntary reporting exercise, which has helped us appreciate even more some of the challenges that these businesses are facing in trying to understand their modern slavery risks and report on them.
Thanks, Natasha. I found it interesting when you spoke about modern slavery, tying it in with Adamantem wanting to create opportunities and participation in the broader ESG framework, because I feel like there's a lot of focus on investors calling for proactive action on the E in the ESG and sustainability and pushing for sustainability metrics, whereas modern slavery element of what normally is seen as the S seems to be more a reputational risk identifying exercise. So I guess my question is, how do we balance the E and the S? And I know you spoke about opportunities in modern slavery, but I just want to drill down into that. And how can organizations be more proactive in not only identifying, but managing modern slavery risk?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think there's a couple of different parts to unpack in that question and a couple of different ways to respond. I think, firstly, you're right, particularly with an Australian context, we see a lot of focus on the E in ESG, particularly in relation to climate change. However, it's not necessarily the case in other parts of the world. I know, for example, in the Asian Pacific region, there's a much larger focus on the G component. And there is increasingly a global trend we are seeing in this responsible investing context towards an increased focus on the social, or the S, particularly from investors, which I would argue includes modern slavery, although I think it goes well beyond just modern slavery to broader human rights risks and other issues relating to social inequality. I think this trend towards the increased investor focus on S, there's been some studies done, including, for example, by RIA, that show a much larger proportion of, for example, impact investors globally are looking at the S side of things. So hopefully that's a good trend that's going to continue, and particularly with developments in legislation and regulations around these types of matters. I do also think the balancing of the E and the S is part of a broader movement, and I kind of referenced it before about wanting to integrate the full range of ESG considerations in supply chain management, and modern slavery reporting regimes in some way have shone a light on this and started these conversations. There's been a number of recent developments overseas and here that we're starting to see the beginning of a trend that is seeing companies being pushed to look at these ESG risks and opportunities, not only in their operations, but also in their supply chains. And I think this helps to move modern slavery beyond, a box-ticking exercise in the S category to being a really important component of a broader supply chain management issues. And I think, there are challenges around that with resourcing and toolkits. But looking at it in that context is one of the best ways organisations can be more proactive in identifying and managing modern slavery risks.
Yeah, that's super helpful. And I think that's a good background to the next question from the audience when we're talking about supply chain and supply chain management. So the question from the audience draws from, it touches on modern slavery and renewables, and in particular the global solar supply chain. So there's been a recent report on Uyghur forced labour in the Xinjiang region in relation to global solar supply chains. And the question asks, from an investor's perspective, it's difficult to affirmatively prove there is modern slavery in the global supply chain, as suppliers, and this may be second-tier, third-tier suppliers, may strongly deny modern slavery claims, and acting early, especially in the case of renewables, could drive up costs in developing projects and exacerbate other social problems, such as climate change. So how do we weigh up the E and the S in ESG in the renewable sector? This is a very pertinent issue, and I know Lauren mentioned cobalt in her introduction as well, and in the battery supply chain, there's child labour in cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So there has been a spotlight shone on the renewable sector, and CEFC, I guess, as a major financier in renewable projects, is particularly sensitive to this issue. It's not an easy one, but I might go back to Abigail. Abigail, I'd be interested to hear your views on this.
Sure. So my views go back to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And so what they say is that you need to, as a business, if you're not causing or contributing to a human rights impact, which I'm going to assume for now the financiers aren't, but they might in some circumstances, and there's some separate papers in relation to that if anyone's interested. It's about exercising your leverage and doing what you can. So it really does depend upon the circumstances. But if you are, for instance, investing, then the questions that you need to pose is of the company that you're investing in, what is it doing to try to manage that risk? Because the Xinjiang region of China is not the only source available of polysilicon. So are there other options? What have you done to work out what risk there is? And it's not enough for the company that you're speaking to have just referred to a website and said, see, there's no problem. Really, depending upon how involved they are, their questions have to be asked in relation to managing the risk. So it is absolutely true that it's not known exactly what's happening. However, that's why it's a risk, as opposed to definitely an issue, a human rights impact that needs to be managed. So the question is how you manage that risk. And there are lots of different ways of managing risk, and they're all balancing up different things. But it's not okay to go with the very cheapest option if that involves very severe impacts upon human rights. And so if you have a project that's only viable because you're using very cheap inputs, then that project is actually not viable. So it's important, if you're looking at opportunities, to take all those things into consideration and to understand more. So we always say that the first step in an assessment is the assessment of the opportunity, the company itself. Then when you're looking at a supply chain, you first of all have to understand who all your suppliers are. Map your entire supply chain. Who are they? How many tiers can you work out beyond that? Or what suppliers go into there? And then work out where your risk is and look at the risky bits. You don't need to look at the entire supply chain in minute detail, because everyone only has a certain number of FTE in their business. You can't afford to drill into absolute detail in relation to absolutely every supplier. However, once you find those with red flags, it's about a dialogue. So you can't do this just by searching on the internet. At some stage, you need to have some kind of communication and understanding in relation to how risk is being managed. And so they're the questions that I would be asking to see whether or not I could be comfortable with an opportunity.
Yeah, thanks, Abigail. I definitely think that's true, that you have to almost take a risk-based approach and you can't just rely on public information. I might pivot just slightly because unfortunately, we know the renewables sector is not alone with having supply chains in these global, offshore, highly vulnerable areas where things aren't exactly clear. I want to touch on, Lauren, maybe your experience in the fashion and apparel industry, which also has forced labour in their global supply chains, but yet, we also see a push for recycled, sustainable fashion. How do you see the future of this industry and how it would manage sort of modern slavery risk there?
Yeah, great question. And the industry is very much tied to these issues, so very, very relevant. I guess the thing I'd say is, and I've found very similar to what Natasha and Abigail have been talking about, like the E out of ESG seems to be more relatable to people in terms of connecting to issues to do with the environment and climate change. It seems to be a bit more digestible. Human rights, especially in the fashion industry, is a little bit difficult. It seems to be more distant. It makes people quite uncomfortable, especially when you're talking about these really, horrible allegations to do with forced labour and, genocide that we're dealing with. So it is grim, and I think sometimes it just becomes a bit like people think it's too hard and they don't really know what to do with it. In some of these places we're talking about, there's a real lack of access to people and knowledge on the ground to exactly know what's going on. And, we know things like regular audits and things like that don't work. But in saying that, I do think that these issues are just becoming more and more pressing. They can't be ignored, and it's the time for change. And, we are seeing expectations within the fashion industry that companies have a social compliance program. We don't know at times how effective these are, to be completely honest, but it is a start. And, we really need to continue to question industry behaviour and interrogating responses to human rights. It's not really good enough for companies these days to say, they're using recycled materials, but, we don't really know what's going on in their supply chain. We don't know what they're doing in terms of human rights. So I think there's much more of an increase in knowledge, especially from consumers, and shareholders that are pressuring companies that you need to have a more balanced view. So I think that's really great to see, and that is encouraging too.
Thanks, Lauren. So as mentioned right at the start when we were talking about what is modern slavery and the Australian legislation, so companies are now required, if they meet the requirements, to report by way of a modern slavery statement. And we've now had the benefit of seeing the first round of modern slavery statements come through, and those of our audience members who are involved in this might be well into preparing their second modern slavery statements. Natasha, I understand in putting together Adamantem's modern slavery statements, you looked not only at your own operations, but also at your portfolio companies, and you spoke to us about the processes you went through there. But I'd like to hear of any challenges you came up against or any modern slavery stories that you could share with us.
Yeah. Yes, we did. So we've supported a range of our portfolio companies to assess the modern slavery risks within their operations and supply chains. And when we started the process, we were aware we wanted to do this across a number of our businesses and wanted to design a kind of process for doing that we could follow. And in doing that and designing that process, we took quite a first principles approach, where we started by assessing the modern slavery risks in their supply chain with the ultimate goal of giving them some tools of improving the way they assess and manage those risks, not so much as being a driver for kind of producing a modern slavery statement, but the content of the work streams that we did ended up being very good work to inform that statement. So we really approached it with trying to create a better risk management environment and stronger supply chain sustainabilities as part of our investments in those businesses. So we worked with an external expert to design the process, and we started with a self-assessment by each business of their own operations and suppliers. And we designed that self-assessment to align with the UN Guiding Principles and the Australian modern slavery legislation. And it was very cross-functional. So one of the first challenges for businesses, there's not a person necessarily that sits within these businesses who is solely responsible for modern slavery. It's quite cross-functional in its application when you start thinking about it for a business. So it involved legal teams, it involved HR teams, it involved procurement and supply chain teams, finance, and a bunch of other areas. So the first challenge is kind of getting all of those people together so that you're extracting the right information and level of detail from the business in order to do a proper assessment. A second challenge I think we've touched on a number of times during this webinar already, which is just the challenge in terms of the information available on supply chains, particularly beyond the first tier. But a little bit similar to the comments about this is all too hard, I don't know what to do. Really the answer to that is start somewhere and start with at least the supply chain that you can identify, and over a period of time look to broaden the net of your supply chain that you're assessing through this process. We then used a framework to assess those responses and using external benchmarks. And we came up with a detailed risk assessment for the portfolio companies using something that Abigail referred to before, which was the caused, contribute to, or linked lens. So looking at which risks these companies which modern slavery risks these companies could cause, could contribute to, or could be linked with. And then this work was really used to do risk red flags kind of identification, again, which was a concept Abigail mentioned before, which we looked at the material risk areas, and then each of these companies have developed multi-year modern slavery action plans to improve the way that they are assessing and addressing material modern slavery risks with their business. I think one of the things that's really challenging and really important in doing this work is buy-in in the businesses, and particularly within the senior levels of these businesses. And this is not something that gets devolved down to kind of a ticker box compliance exercise if it's going to be done properly. And we designed that process, the way we achieved this, and there's many ways to do that, but we held half-day senior management and board workshop sessions, which were in part training on modern slavery risks, but also part designed to workshop how to address the findings of those risk assessments. And getting that buy-in from the board and the senior management level is really key to embedding these concepts in an organisation. As for modern slavery stories, nothing specific, and I think that is also a function of how new this concept is and how far up the supply chain it can go. Absolutely, our companies have identified regions and products with specific high risks and have started focusing on those ones to take steps to mitigate those risks. They've started doing some of the basic action things, but a lot of what they can do comes back to the concept of leverage that Abigail referred to before. So it's a matter of identifying where your high risk is, but for these companies also what parts of their supply chain they have leverage in that they can actually do something about. And that's really where they've started their focus.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. I think what you mentioned there and about working across the different teams and buying from senior management really comes out in even the AXI report. So the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors published a report just recently in July 2021, which touches on the ASX 200 companies and how they reported against the Modern Slavery Act requirements. And I imagine this would be of particular interest to our audience members. So you should be able to see on your screen somewhere a link where you can download that actual report and digest it outside of this webinar. But I just want to touch on the findings on that report and maybe come back to you, Abigail. Do you mind providing us with a snapshot coming out of AXI's findings and what the current state of play is?
I thought it was a really interesting report, actually, because there was a lot of complaints when the UK had a Modern Slavery Act for a number of years before Australia did. And there was a race to the bottom in the UK, to be honest. So the reports, because their modern slavery statements didn't have mandatory reporting criteria, quite often they said almost nothing in relation to the most important things, like where is your risk? So in the UK, we very much were viewing it as a race to the bottom. So what the AXI report refers to is kind of a race to the middle. So this is particularly in the ASX 200. So I want to stress that That's not necessarily the picture everywhere. So there are a number of reporters who are just trying to comply. In fact, I think there's actually quite a lot of entities who, particularly in year one, are just trying to make sure their report covers the things that they need to cover. And even then, the ACSI report talks about a number of areas where there hasn't been compliance. So that might be because the things that are being reported on have been done, but they haven't been adequately referred to in the statements, or it might be because they're not done. What the ACSI report does, though, is it looks also at best practice and says, look, here's some things that people are doing compliance and not compliance, and here's what would be best practice. So for anyone who's looking at wants to understand what best practice is, there's a number of guides in that report about what would be better under certain of the criteria. So I think it's really useful from that perspective. The other thing that's really important about it, I think, is that as companies go and they draft statements, they don't really get a feeling for whether or not they've done a good job or whether or not there's really compliance. And so I do think it's important for NGOs and groups like ACSI to go through and review, because it also makes it worthwhile doing. So if you're doing a report and it becomes a ticker box exercise and no one looks at it, that's actually a waste of time. We should all stop. But if what happens is people become genuinely interested in what is being done, and this stops being a really formulaic thing, which it was to some degree in year one because everyone was creating frameworks. So I got a framework and I got a modern slavery policy and I did this and I did this and I did this. What we're expecting from year two onwards is that people start talking about how they managed actual risks that they identified. So what I'm really interested in is going off and doing a risk assessment, working out where your risk is, and then what are you doing with the companies that you've identified that you've found risk in? How are you working with them? And that's what people's reports, I'm anticipating things like little pop-ups in people's statements that say, here's this project we did. Here's what we are doing in these particular circumstances. And that's when these things become meaningful. They're not so meaningful when we're creating frameworks and policies, because it's really about implementation. And so really that's where we think we're expecting. And if I were looking at companies, I would be looking at, fine, you have all these policies and procedures, that should be a given. Now, beyond the policies and procedures, tell me how you're implementing them. They're the kind of questions that I would be asking you. Show me a case where you've actually spoken to a supplier that you identified at high risk and what you said to them. We've also had financiers who've come to us to talk about particular customers and whether or not they should seek financing them because of the risk in their supply chains. And so that's showing a much more mature attitude too, where financiers are taking a view in relation to whether or not they should be funding projects that not only looks at the company, but looks at its suppliers and risks that are arising in that area.
Thanks, Abigail. Yeah, I agree that now we've got the framework and it's judging the effectiveness of the actions taken. That's the real difficult part. And I think the ACSI report highlights that. And I agree that's probably the most challenging area of responding to this Modern Slavery Act requirements. And hopefully now that most of these organisations have these frameworks, we can really focus on how we judge the effectiveness of the actions taken. Natasha, you mentioned, Adamantem's obviously released the first modern slavery statement, and it might well be into preparing its second. But how do you see Adamantem approaching this requirement of seeing how effective its actions are?
Yeah, it's definitely one of the more challenging aspects of the regime. And I think the first step is to do exactly what people have spent the last year doing, which is actively understand the kind of the risk setting and the environment in which you're operating. I agree with Abigail's comments that really what you've got to do now is talk about implementation, and that's really getting down into the nitty-gritty of exactly what steps are you going to take? What does your action plan look like? What by when and which people are accountable for achieving that. And I think setting that out in very clear and transparent terms, both internally within the company and as part of your external reporting, has to be the first part of the step in responding to effectiveness. I do think we also need to understand that businesses are on the start of what we should kind of consider to be a continuous improvement journey. If you look overseas to some of the examples in areas that have had this type of reporting for a little bit longer, you can see some companies starting to select some early stage KPIs or metrics to report against to assess effectiveness. And at the moment, they're pretty what I would call output focused. They're not so much down the outcome end of the spectrum, but they're quite output. They're looking at things like percentage of senior management that's undertaken training, or percentage of suppliers that in high risk categories that have been engaged with and completed a modern slavery questionnaire, or discussed signing supplier codes of conduct, or those types of things. And I'm not saying they are sufficient, but they are probably necessary steps in the right direction. And companies should be considering these kinds of ways that they can set targets and KPIs that they can report against, which go to this concept of effectiveness. I do also think that there is a role here potentially for some of the global sustainability reporting frameworks, like a SASB or a GRI, to help develop some proposed kind of reporting standards to help companies understand the best way to report on their modern slavery effectiveness. And at the moment, that's very much a work in progress.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, and I definitely think it's a watch this space. So one area that the report identified where companies scored low was in describing modern slavery risks. A lot of our audience members come from the finance industry, which presumably would be an industry where its own modern slavery risk rating would be categorized as low. Lauren, how would you advise financial organizations approach identifying and describing modern slavery risks?
Yeah, look, I think it's a tricky one because, again, it's about understanding that we are connected to the issues. And although finance industry, may be classed as low, it actually intersects with so many different industries, products, sectors and geographies, which are high risk. And these are part of their operations and supply chains, even if they aren't direct relationships, even if they aren't tier one, we are connected to them. So again, this could be anything from cleaning to textiles to automotive industry to agriculture. And I guess what I'd advise for companies to do is dig deeper, really look at how their companies do intersect with these risks. It may not be in their immediate remit, but if you start digging, that's when you'll really actually get a better picture of what those risks are and what you can do to address them. And to take a holistic approach when it comes to doing that kind of risk assessment and the reporting. What I've found is, after reading a lot of reports myself, there hasn't been a lot of clarity in terms of businesses describing those risks. And I think a lot of it comes down to, businesses taking a really high level approach to the way that they write their reports. So I've actually come away at times and I'm not really sure where the risks are and whereabouts they are in their operations and supply chains, because that's not clear. And I think that's really quite problematic. So I think that's something we can do better. And I'd really like to see some improvements with that going forward.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. Before we go to the Q&A part of the discussion, I just want to draw to where we see modern slavery evolving, and particularly, I think we mentioned other jurisdictions briefly in our discussion, but for our audience members with operations in Europe and in the US, Abigail, could you provide us with some insight on how modern slavery regulation is evolving there and where you see Australia headed?
Sure. So I think the other jurisdiction that's most moving in this area is Europe, so the EU. So the European Commission has some some draft legislation that it's prepared in relation to a due diligence obligation for companies. So that's important because there are two different types of pieces of legislation, and one of them requires reporting, which is what Australia has, except for New South Wales government, who have a due diligence obligation or a reasonable evidence obligation, which is not yet enforced. But apart from that tiny little bit, Australia has a reporting piece of legislation, so does the UK, and so does California. So the California Supply Chain Transparency Act was actually the beginning of all of this. In Europe, there is a plan to introduce sustainability obligations. So it's not just human rights, it's also environmental, etc. So it's anticipated that the EU Parliament will pass something towards the end of the year. So if that happens, then each EU member state will have to go and legislate in relation to this area. So that is a substantial change because nearly every large entity in the world is operating in Europe somewhere. Germany has recently passed a piece of legislation which comes into force on the 1st of January 2023, which says that all companies with 3,000 or more employees in Germany need to adopt a reasonable endeavour, like a due diligence process. So Germany will be first, and that reduces down in the following year to, I think, 1,000 employees. And they need to adopt what's known as human rights due diligence. So human rights due diligence is the UN guiding principles that we've been referring to. It is a process of going and identifying and responding to the risks that have been identified. The Netherlands has adopted a child labour law, which is going to be enforced by early next year. And so it also, it focuses in on child labour, which we know is only one part of modern slavery, but it does deal with child labour risk. So Canada has a draft piece of legislation as well. The way the US deals with this risk is quite different. So US has adopted primarily, apart from California, sanctions type approach. So they're doing it as an import, which is really interesting. So when you're dealing with US companies, there's a lot less focus internally in relation to operational risk and a lot more focus in relation to making sure they don't breach sanctions in importing products known to be connected with particular types of slavery. So that's quite a different approach. It also externalises control, and it means that it's really driven by government, whereas when you adopt a piece of legislation like Australia has, or the due diligence obligations, it's really driven by each company's approach and how it sees its own risk. What I would say is that this is not something that is going away. Australia was an early actor, but so we're early on the wave, which is good because we're a country that surfs. So we're early, but it's not like we're going to be on the wave by ourselves. So what I see with clients a lot also is that in year one, there's been a focus on just getting the Australia statement done, but there's a significant desire to get to the point where a global group statement is produced. But so much more work would need to be done to do a global group statement, but the decision is made in year one. Let's just do an Australian one, but can we talk about how we might do something that is our global group? Because typically companies are, their major suppliers are often, for instance, their siblings. And so a global group statement makes a lot more sense, and you know a lot more about your supply chain if they are siblings of yours. So I recommend people to keep on focusing on it. It's not going away, and there's going to be increasingly information available. And although you can look at statements that have been issued, you do need to look at the statements that have been prepared, understanding that it is the first year. So it's not going to be a perfect description. And we did see a lot of increasing maturity in statements when the UK Modern Slavery Act came out. There was a lot of criticisms of reports of certain Australian companies in relation to the lack of detail. And that's partly for fear of saying something that's misleading. So if there was a safe harbour law in relation to what you say, you might find out more. But the lack of willingness to expressly describe things, I think, really does come from the fear that if I say out loud what our risk is and I'm too clear about it, people might not invest in me, or people might not do business with me, etc. So we have to, as a business community, also go forward saying it's okay if you find a risk, as long as you're taking active steps to manage that risk. And what I want to see most in a statement is someone who found their risk and is helping solve it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, to be transparent and to show you're doing something about it. We have actually received a whole bunch of questions while we've been talking, so I might just start with the first one. So the question asks, how can we determine what ambitious goals around modern slavery are for any company or sector? I might ask Natasha this one. Natasha, what would you see as ambitious goals?
I think that's a really hard question to answer in the general. I think it is really company specific because back to the point that Lauren made very early on in this conversation is the risks for each company are so specific to your industry, the location of your supply chains, and the products and the services that are supplied in as part of those supply chains. So what looks ambitious for one company may not be particularly ambitious for another company. So I think you have to take a really risk-adjusted view of that. I think from a broad conceptual level, you can drill it down to some concepts of what looks ambitious. So I think that comes back to some of these points that we've discussed in various parts here. What is ambitious is not just understanding and having frameworks and having policies. What is ambitious is actually doing something about it, actually reporting and being transparent about what you're doing about it, and actually have a way of measuring the outcome of what you've done. So as a concept, that is what is ambitious. I think it's very hard to comment on specifically. I don't think I can give you this is an ambitious modern slavery goal. As I said, we invest in companies across a range of different sectors and industries, and for some of our businesses, they have lower levels of modern slavery risks than others. Absolutely none of them found no modern slavery risk, but I think it has to be risk adjusted.
Thank you. The next question asks, and this one might be for you, Abigail, have you, from the clients that's come through your doors, have you ever seen lenders seeking to limit their exposures to poorly performing companies? So I assume there by poorly performing, they mean with poor modern slavery risks ratings.
Yeah, so I think most lenders these days have in place a kind of ESG assessment that they're doing in relation to at least the more significant lending that they do. But also there are investment decisions that are being made. So I do know entities that have been told that if they didn't fix up their ESG performance, that they would be divested by Canadian pension funds. So there are ethical investors out there. And when you think about the investment world in Australia, there are a number of ethical investors who, if they're staying true to their investment protocols, need to say you need to do better or we can't invest in you because you're not, in inverted commas, sustainable, because sustainable is not I deal with my climate risk. And I've been saying for a while that ESG, the E in ESG is not C, and the S is not silent. And so I think this firmly falls in human rights, sits in S. But the other thing that's really interesting to me about the S is that what human right really matters is really dependent actually on the jurisdiction that you're in. So right now, people in the United States, in relation to ESG, the S bit that they really care about is Black Lives Matter. So they really care about racial equality. And so talking to them about modern slavery in their supply chains, it's real because their business partners are caring and asking them, but what they care really about as a nation is that Black Lives Matter's racial equity.
The next question from the audience we have. So the audience member talks about a conversation that they had with a large consumer goods company who are only just starting to report on the Modern Slavery Act. There is a sense of distrust about industry collaboration with regards to private brands. and the RBA might not necessarily cover an extent of hard goods. What can organizations do to collaborate? How do you create long-established trust relationships with suppliers, and how can they encourage suppliers to be more to provide greater disclosure to reassure, I guess, lenders or financiers? Lauren, do you have a view on this one?
Yeah, I guess from a collaboration perspective, we are starting to see more industry collaborations, and I think they're essential. I think, if companies feel like they don't have leverage, that's a way that they can get it to work together. I do understand, though, that kind of trust issue, and I think it's really important, I guess, to establish groups where, you feel like you can have an honest conversation, and you can actually start dealing with some of the issues and directly addressing them. In some cases, I do see like a lot of forums and things like that, and I think they're really useful, but I'd really like to see more collaboration, because I think that's where we can actually solve some of these issues. Sorry, Kelly, you might have to remind me the second part.
Yeah. How can we encourage suppliers to be more transparent, to provide more disclosure?
Okay. Yeah. Look, it's a really tricky one. I think, again, trust becomes an issue, because some suppliers feel like they're, why should they divulge all their business information to you? And that is kind of a process that you have to work through. So I think it's about really building strong relationships. We are getting to the point, although this is new, it is getting more popular. It is going to become the norm. So a lot of the conversations I've had in the past have been, this is the way forward. It's an expectation that we have this level of transparency, and that we're working with companies that share our values. So there does become a point where, you need to work with companies and work on that continuous improvement approach. It's not about telling them they're doing the wrong things. It's about how can we actually solve some of these issues together. But sometimes it does have to be quite a difficult conversation, where it's, if they're not willing, to give us this information, that's a really hard one, because that's where you get the risk, I think. So I think it's about just building that trust, and that open and honesty, but also evidence-based. So, following that up with audits and questionnaires, and with, if you can, on the ground initiatives, because I think if we're not doing that evidence, you don't really have a clue as to what's actually going on.
Yeah. I think the next question, touches on the point when we spoke about the renewable sector, and basically it says independent third-party confirmation that modern slavery is not present in certain manufacturing regions of China. Getting that is really hard. And so how do we in Australia gain sufficient comfort that this risk is not present? Abigail, I know you spoke to that question previously when we were discussing it. Do you see how we in Australia can gain comfort from whether there's modern slavery in regions in China? I know we can rely, there's public reports out there, but do you have any thoughts on this one?
Well, I think we should be really concerned. I know as much. I've read as much as potentially the people who are asking the question. So what we know sitting in Australia is that there is risk. That's what we know. So then we have to work out, are we doing enough to manage that risk? And I really fundamentally agree with the point about it's about working together. So you as let's say you run a business that uses solar. By yourselves, it's going to be very difficult to conquer that, particularly if you're an Australian business and you're importing solar cells. However, if you're working with your peers in relation to that risk, that's something that may be much more manageable. And at least you can try to find out some information. So because I'm a lawyer, I need to say you need to be careful about competition law and not agreeing, how to act in certain ways. But the answer is not to try not do anything just because you know it's a difficult issue. you have to at least start trying to inform yourself in relation to the risk. And for instance, if you can't get comfortable in relation to the risk, that's not the only place you can get these products. So maybe you're looking for alternatives as well. But the preference is not to give away suppliers. The preference is to make sure suppliers are doing the right thing. And that should always be the first step, because what we want to do is improve the status of the people who are working in situations where they might actually be enslaved, and to try to stop that.
Yeah. Natasha, I think the next question is for you. So it says, what steps are actually involved in understanding whether your suppliers are acting responsibly?
I think there's a range of steps, and I think it covers a continuum, and I think it starts at the very beginning of figuring out who your suppliers are, which sounds like a really obvious starting point, but that is actually not a simple task in many cases. So, you know, start with your tier, and the way we did it with our companies is start with your tier one. So start with the ones that you should at least know who they are because they supply you directly. And then, you over time, gradually expand that net to go beyond your tier one suppliers. There's a challenge in that. There's a lot more technology and tools that need to be developed to help companies do this in a more efficient way. But that's your starting point. Your second step is exactly some of the points that's been raised a number of times, is engage with those suppliers. This is not just then go onto their website and have a look at whether they have a modern slavery policy and that ticks a box. It's so some of the things we've done, for example, is developed supplier questionnaires for high-risk suppliers and send them out to your suppliers and ask them to fill them in, and then engage with them after you've done that. And we've actually found that that has generated some really great conversations with some of our suppliers, and depending on the industry and the sector you're in, has actually a really positive response in terms of supplier relationships. Then it becomes trying to figure out, okay, once I've got those supplier questionnaire answers, where are my risks and what are the next steps that I'm going to take? I'm conscious of time, so I cut that a bit short.
Yeah, thanks, Natasha. Yeah, I think that wraps up today's webinar. I just really want to pause and thank our three panelists for sharing their expertise and also their honest experiences. With modern slavery, it's clear we don't have all the answers, but I think one thing that really stood out for me is that we have to ask the question and continue the conversation. And I'm really encouraged to see so many people join today and ask so many questions about this area. So let's keep the conversation going. Thank you.